The logic of questions, sometimes called erotetic logic, is the formal study of questions, questioning, and question-answer relations. While classical logic has traditionally focused on declarative sentences, statements that are true or false, the logic of questions investigates whether questions themselves can be analyzed using formal tools. This field asks whether questions have a logical structure, whether they can stand in inferential relations, and how they relate to answers. Although questions are central to inquiry, science, and everyday reasoning, they have received far less formal attention than assertions. The logic of questions aims to fill this gap by developing precise ways of representing and evaluating questions. An important distinction in this field is between questions and interrogatives. Interrogatives are linguistic expressions, sentences with interrogative form such as "Who wrote Hamlet?" or "Is it raining?" A question, by contrast, is often understood as the abstract content or informational request expressed by an interrogative. Different interrogative sentences can express the same question, and the same interrogative sentence can express different questions in different contexts. For this reason, many logicians argue that the object of formal study should be questions themselves, not merely interrogative sentences. Interrogative sentences are often used to express questions, but they can perhaps have other functions as well. For example, the sentence "Can you pass the salt?" can be used to ask a question, but it can also be used to say the same thing as the imperative "Pass the salt, please." Logicians and philosophers often distinguish between several kinds of questions. For example, yes, no questions, such as "Is the door open?" WH questions, such as "Who is the president?" or "Why did it happen?" Alternative questions, such as "Is the light on or off?" Open versus closed questions, depending on whether the range of possible answers is finite or infinite. Presupposition-laden questions, which assume certain facts, such as "Have you stopped lying?" Each type raises different formal issues concerning admissible answers, presuppositions, and logical structure. One influential approach treats a question as a set of possible answers. On this view, a question partitions logical space into alternatives corresponding to its potential answers. For example, the question "Is it raining?" corresponds to the set "It is raining," "It is not raining." Answering the question amounts to selecting one element of this set. This approach has been highly influential in semantics and logic, especially in work on information and inquiry. It allows questions to be compared, embedded in larger structures, and evaluated in terms of how much information they request. Another tradition analyzes questions as a kind of imperative, roughly equivalent to commands such as "Tell me whether it is raining." On this view, questions are not truth-apt, but directive in nature. They request information rather than assert facts. This approach highlights the pragmatic role of questions in communication, but raises difficulties for formal logic. If questions are imperatives, then standard truth-based notions of validity and consequence may not apply. Some logicians attempt to overcome this by combining the logic of questions with imperative logic, epistemic and doxastic logic, and by introducing alternative semantic notions based on concepts such as correctness or appropriateness. A more abstract approach treats questions as intentional entities, comparable to propositions but with a different semantic role. On this view, questions are functions from possible worlds to sets of answers, or entities whose identity depends on informational distinctions rather than truth conditions alone. This approach allows for fine-grained distinctions between questions that have the same answers in the actual world, but differ in informational structure. It is especially useful in modal and epistemic contexts, where questions interact with knowledge, belief, and uncertainty. Logicians studying questions have addressed a number of formal issues, such as: when does one question entail another? Can questions be logically equivalent? What makes a question answerable? How do questions presuppose certain facts? Can questions be embedded in larger logical constructions? These issues require extensions of standard logical machinery and raise deep questions about the nature of inference and meaning. The logic of questions is a controversial and relatively underdeveloped field. Some philosophers doubt whether questions can be treated formally at all, arguing that they essentially depend on pragmatic or contextual factors. Others worry that different kinds of questions require fundamentally different theories. Nevertheless, many believe that a formal study of questions is both possible and valuable. Questions play a central role in reasoning, inquiry, everyday thinking, and scientific progress, and understanding their structure may illuminate how knowledge is sought and acquired. Although the logic of questions remains less developed than classical logic, it represents an important and growing area of research. By extending formal methods beyond statements to include questions, logicians aim to provide a more complete account of rational inquiry and information exchange.